I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On this episode, the Stand Up and Holler NFL Draft Special. We will cover the draft from top to bottom with the Florida Gators here. Richardson leads the way early. Ventrell Miller kicks off day 3. Gator alum Howie Roseman is just stacking up Bulldogs in Philly. He had something to say about that this weekend. And we'll wrap up evaluating the conference breakdowns, plus a few interesting ties to the recruiting with recruiting and the NFL draft from Will Miles himself. Will, how's it going tonight, man?
It's going well, dude. Obviously, you and I are coming down to the closing stretch of the magazine, so that's been taking up a lot of our time. Not as much content up on the website because we're busy writing for this thing behind the scenes, but we're excited to put this thing out. We've gotten a really good response from everybody here on YouTube. We are actually extending the pre-order time back to May 8th. So we'd originally said May 1st. We've got a little bit more clarity on publication dates. So May 8th, if you go over to readandreaction.com/MAG, that's readandreaction.com/mag, you can get it for a reduced price. Price is going to go up after May 8th. We'll have some extra copies, so we'll be able to send those out. But we're going to have to do multiple print runs after May 8th, so we need people to get those orders in. So pre-order before May 8th, get a discount, and get that there right around Memorial Day, which will mean that if you want to give it to your father or you want to give it to somebody for Father's Day, that's a great opportunity there to have it in their hands for the summer, all the summer trips people are going on, that sort of stuff. Obviously, there's going to be transfer portal stuff going on. We will likely have some sort of digital addendum that we send out to people who order it. So don't worry. The digital is going to come out on Memorial Day. You'll be, or on the digital will come out on Memorial Day. You'll be able to buy it then if all you want is the digital copy. But if you're missing out on some of the content that's in there, we will send you the digital version, or at least all the updated stuff once, if you buy the hard copy before then.
Yeah, I mean, if we wrote a newspaper every single day, we might not be able to keep up with the transfer portal, right? That's the way.
I don't know. There hasn't been
clicking
anybody
right
coming
now.
into the transfer portal recently, so needs to pick up a little bit pretty soon.
Yeah. So anyway, I will put the link readandreaction.com/mag in the description here for the episode. So you'll see that again, the episode. If you want to click on that, it's below in the description. All right, let's move in. Let's jump into the show here. 2 bits. Anthony Richardson, as expected, top 5 draft pick here, the Indianapolis Colts, second highest quarterback in program history in the NFL draft. The first being, of course, Steve Spurrier, 3rd overall to San Francisco, 1967. There's only been 3 other first-round Gator quarterbacks, Will. John Reeves, 14th to Philadelphia in 1972. Rex Grossman, 22nd to Chicago in 2003. And Tim Tebow, 25th to Denver in 2010. So Shane Steichen here, the Eagles offensive coordinator last year, who worked with Jalen Hurts the last couple of years. I like the fit, Will, in terms of who he's developed with Hurts here. And during the 2 seasons as offensive coordinator in Philly, his offense is ranked 1st in the NFL in rushing yards per game and rushing touchdowns over that time. So it is a system where they're going to run the ball. They're going to be able to use Richardson's running ability, but one of the things I love about what Indianapolis has done here is that they brought Gardner Minshew in, and Minshew was with Steichen last year in Philadelphia, so he knows the offense. The last couple of years, actually, traded during the Urban Meyer era from Jacksonville to Philly, and after Trevor Lawrence came into Jacksonville there. And Minshew knows that offense like the back of his hand, I would assume, after 2 seasons. So it will be Minshew early on, very likely, I would expect. But Minshew, overall, we've seen enough of him to know who he is. He's a guy that can do some work in a spot start, probably a middling to below average starter if you're going to go with him for the whole season. So I do expect to see Richardson at some point this year. It would be cool to see him in some type of package system with the Colts, but we'll see how that goes early on. But I would expect Richardson to be the starter going into year 2. And I think, unfortunately, as a Jags fan, I do like the fit in Indianapolis. He's not going to be rushed into starting duty, and he'll get a chance to develop with a guy that has a track record of developing a quarterback with a lot of similar traits. Maybe Richardson's even an upgraded version in terms of traits from Jalen Hurts. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out in Indy.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting. I think Jalen Hurts had a pedigree of winning and a pedigree of playing in big games and a
Mm,
pedigree of making big plays when he had the opportunity, and was sort of pedestrian in terms of his ability to throw the ball at Alabama, and then was really, really good at Oklahoma. We haven't seen that from Anthony Richardson yet.
mhm.
Now, part of that is because Richardson hasn't had the same number of starts, right? I mean, you get Jalen Hurts, he comes in, starts as a true freshman, ends up playing in the national championship game that first year, obviously then goes through the battles with Tua there at Alabama as well, loses that battle, transfers to Oklahoma, almost wins the Heisman Trophy there at Oklahoma. So, look, Anthony Richardson maybe was the front runner for the Heisman after the Utah game, but after that Kentucky game, definitely was not. And so, they have very different college profiles. I think what you can say though is that they have very similar weaknesses in terms of what you think about coming into the league. Coming into the league, the knock on Jalen Hurts was accuracy, right? And then the other knock was you're not going to be able to keep a quarterback healthy running an offense like that. And Philadelphia ran a lot of triple option type stuff last year with Hurts, where the third option, the pitch that you think of in the Nebraska offenses with Tom Osborne, wasn't necessarily a pitch. It was a throw out, a wide receiver screen out to somebody who was wide and had an opportunity to run. So, look, the Colts don't have a lot of weapons. They weren't great last year. They're not going to be great just because Anthony Richardson comes in. You mentioned Gardner Minshew's probably going to get a bulk of the time. However, I'd be surprised if Anthony Richardson isn't in there starting by week 8, 9, or 10, right? But before Thanksgiving, I think Anthony Richardson is going to be taking the reins just because the Colts in many ways are going to be kind of playing for that number one pick again. And, to be able to really the best of both worlds would be Richardson comes in, gets experience, kind of has a first year like Peyton Manning. Manning threw a ton of interceptions. I think he threw like 30 interceptions his first year there. But by the time they were done with that year, they knew what they had in Manning, but they still were like 3-13 or 4-12 or something like that. And then you can trade back for a quarter. There's a quarterback needy team that's going to want to trade up, just like Carolina traded up this year. And you start stockpiling draft picks. And what do? Offensive linemen, tight ends, defensive linemen, and you start really sort of supplementing what you have there with Anthony Richardson. So look, I would have liked to have seen Richardson go to the Seahawks. That was where I had identified where I thought his best fit would be, coming in there behind Geno Smith, with Pete Carroll having worked with Russell Wilson, and then them being closer to being an elite team, right? Because they made the playoffs last year, even with Geno Smith. But with Steichen coming in from the Eagles, having experience with a quarterback with similar skills, but nobody has similar skills to Anthony Richardson. That's the reason he went fourth overall, because it certainly wasn't productivity. So harnessing those skills is going to be Steichen's job. We'll see whether he can do it or not.
So I look at it this way, Will. If he turns Richardson into even 70% of what Hurts was last season, that's going to be a highly successful NFL career. You're going to be well above average starter if you can become even 70% of what Hurts was last season.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if Hurts doesn't get hurt last year, he wins the MVP, right? So,
Mhm.
so we're not exactly, and he led the Eagles to the Super Bowl and
Right.
was a huge reason why they were in that Super Bowl. I mean, he went toe to toe with Mahomes, had the one turnover on the fumble in the first half that kind of kept Kansas City in it. But other than that, Hurts played great in that game, and played hurt too. His shoulder was injured during the playoffs as well. So look, I think you can do a lot worse than equaling what Jalen Hurts has done in Philadelphia. But I think the other thing you have to realize is that Philadelphia has very special guys on the offensive linemen. Both Kelsey and Lane Johnson are great offensive linemen. They got the offensive lineman from Florida State, who then transferred to Alabama. I can't remember his name, but he was on the offensive line last year for Philadelphia as well. They have done a really good job of bringing in guys and building that offensive line to where they have a dominant run game. Hurts is part of that dominant run game. Having the extra guy certainly makes a difference. But look, they have that whole Philadelphia team is a complete team, or was a complete team last year. It's a ways for the Colts to get there, right? The Colts are not a complete team. They were close in a few games last year, and guys like Matt Ryan weren't able to get him over the hump. Certainly guys like Sam Ehlinger weren't able to get him over the hump. Anthony Richardson is an upgrade over them. And so, look, I think Colts fans are going to be really interested to see what they can get. I think Gators fans are going to be really interested in what they can get. I actually grew up in Indianapolis, so I'm not a Colts fan. My brother is. So it's going to be interesting. I sort of gauged his interest, and he's like, well, I was frustrated watching him last year when he was in Florida. So, I know what the experience is like, and I think it is going to be a little bit of a roller coaster ride to start with. The question will be, can he get to where he levels off that roller coaster? Because the ceiling is enormous, and where that floor is going to settle will be high. It's just going to be a question of what's the deviation from that floor. If he goes out and throws 4 picks every other week, well, people are going to get frustrated. If he goes out and, is able to start putting together the kinds of performances we think he's capable of, then he's going to be worth the 4th pick. Look, though, I think this is an interesting one because somebody asked me at work the other day whether Richardson was worth it at, I think, like 9 or 10 was where they were. Like, if they had fallen, I think he was thinking the Eagles, but he wasn't going to go to the Eagles. But if he fell to 9 or 10, would he be worth it? Right. And the answer I had was, at 9 or 10, you're not getting yourself fired as a general manager. You look at him at 10 and go, that's value for a player of his caliber and of his skill set. It's worth taking the risk there. At 4, this is the kind of draft pick that can get you fired if it doesn't turn out right. So, new staff in Indianapolis, they've sort of hitched their wagons to Anthony Richardson, which means he's going to get an opportunity to show what he can do. This isn't going to be one of those things where he comes in the last year of a regime, all those guys get fired, and then they haven't really bought into him. That's kind of what happened to Tim Tebow, right? He gets drafted into Denver with Josh McDaniels. McDaniels is gone a couple years later, and Tebow just never gets a shot once they bring in, obviously they trade for Peyton Manning, but beyond that, could you have used him in like a 4th down capacity or a 3rd down capacity and had him run the ball? Sure. And I'm not sure that Tebow is that much worse than Brock Osweiler. So, I think Richardson is going to get a fair shot in Indianapolis. So that's cool.
We'll see how it develops. Again, the Jags fan in me was like, oh, the Colts. He had to go to the Colts. All right. But good luck to Anthony Richardson. Big time. Good for the program. If he goes and excels, it's going to be good to have Richardson as that as a face for the Gators out there in the NFL. The second Gator off the board was Gervon Dexter, going in the 2nd round, 53rd pick to Chicago. The Bears invested heavily into the defense. They also drafted Tyreek Stevenson from Miami at corner, Noah Sewell, the linebacker from Oregon, and they also took another defensive tackle here in the 3rd round with Zach Pickens from South Carolina. So Dexter figures to be a contributor early on with this Chicago lineup. If you go on to ourlads.com, they're already projecting him as a starter on the depth chart for the 2nd year of Matt Eberflus in Chicago. So they need some help up the middle, and they're certainly getting it with Dexter. It will be interesting to see how he develops. Florida, during his time at Florida, there wasn't a whole lot of help around Dexter up the middle, and we saw him. We talked about how we felt like he wore down as the game went along last year at times, but he was asked, they asked a lot of the guy during his time here. So it'll be interesting to see how he develops in Chicago when he's used probably more in a capacity that can fit what he needs to do down to down.
Yeah, it's funny that we've talked about Anthony Richardson being a projection. I think Gervon Dexter is a projection as well, right? You're sitting there looking at his high school profile, looking at his athletic ability, looking at the time he put on the 40 and the other athletic things that he did during the combine, and saying, yeah, he was on a defense that really didn't give him a whole bunch of help in the SEC, and he's going to get more help in the NFL, so we expect him to be able to hold his own. I think it was Bud Davis did a study on him last year where he looked at him in the first half and he was basically an all SEC level defensive lineman. And then in the second half, he was below average. And, that sort of goes to what you were saying about him sort of tiring out by the time the game ended. And there just weren't enough guys to rotate in. So that's going to be the question for Chicago is, yeah, he might be the starting defensive tackle, but you're going to have to be able to give him a blow. You're going to have to rotate people in. That's not news in the NFL. You need to do that if you're every NFL team. And so I think he'll get that opportunity. I still think this is probably a little bit high in terms of general productivity. There were guys who went around Dexter who had more productivity, but Dexter really, from the recruiting ranking to the physical traits and all those sorts of things, projects as a guy who can produce like a 2nd round pick. The Bears traded up to get him, so they certainly think that's they certainly think that's true. And like I said, the draft is always about projection. It's not what did this guy do in college, it's what can he do once we get him in the NFL and in our program. And that's the thing, is I think people look at his physical skills and say, we're going to be able to mold him and have him be really effective at what we're asking him to do because of those physical skills. And so it's worth taking, not a flyer, but it's worth taking a projection in the 2nd round.
So Dexter to the Bears in the 2nd round. Another 2nd round pick from Florida here, Osiris Torrance, ends up in Buffalo. Will the Jags they could have had Torrance. They could have had him in the 2nd round. That would have been nice. But he slips to the back half of the 2nd round here. He'll compete for playing time. I'm not sure he'll start right away because they did sign 2 guards this offseason. They also re-signed a guard last offseason. So there's definitely some competition there, but you could tell Buffalo wants to address that position. But overall, Maybe he won't start immediately, but he'll eventually project to be a starter in the long run here for the Bills. I just think it's a great situation. How could it not be? You're going into one of the best offenses in football right now with a quarterback that's got plenty of time left in his prime here.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. As productive as he was being a first-team All-American, unanimous All-American, you sort of assumed he was going to be in like the latter half of the first round, where you're sitting there going, you don't take a guard in the top 15 picks, but once you get to 26, 27, 28, okay, it's worth taking an offensive lineman who's going to help your running game and going to make sure your quarterback doesn't end up on his back. So for the Bills to get him at 59 overall, I mean, I texted you at the time, like, that's a steal. Like, and for as good as that offense is, to be, you get injuries on the offensive line. That's just the reality. Josh Allen runs a lot. You need to be able to protect Josh Allen. You need to make sure that guys aren't mauling him, and Osiris Torrance is going to be able to help that. So, the Bills just got the best guard in the SEC last year by far, and really the best guard in the nation last year by far. It late in the second round, that's a steal. I mean, this is a guy who, going 40th would have surprised me, but I still think that if I had the opportunity to take Osiris Torrance or Will Levis, I would have taken Torrance. So, he got taken a bunch of picks below Levis, about the same amount as everybody thought he would, just in a different round. So, look, I think it stinks for Torrance, because if he'd have been drafted late in the first round, it's millions and millions more dollars. But he's going to get his opportunity for a second contract, and I think Buffalo's going to put him in a good situation to be able to do that.
Now, this question is a loaded question a little bit here, Will. Were you surprised that Will Levis dropped? Not based on your own evaluation and your own opinion, but based on all the chatter around Levis throughout the entire draft process, including some rumors a couple days leading up to it that he might even go number one. Were you surprised he fell to round two?
No, because all those NFL scouts who were there in the second game of the year last year to watch Anthony Richardson fall flat against Kentucky saw Will Levis be just as bad on the other side. Like, I get it. I understand that he's got a cannon, but there's more to play in the position than that. And, this is a guy who couldn't beat out Clifford at Penn State, and then comes to Kentucky, and Kentucky's offense wasn't like great shakes with Will Levis in charge. It's not like they were going up and down the field like Hendon Hooker was with Tennessee. Now, you could say that has to do with Mark Stoops and the offensive coordinators and those sorts of things. Levis was good. He wasn't fantastic. And so I never understood the first round hype around him. And I think when he played against defenses that were halfway decent, he struggled. So, there's a lot to like about sort of his physical skills, but, like Richardson projects to be elite, and you overlook the wins and losses because of his special skills. Will Levis has a cannon, but other than that, there's not like this other set of special skills that I see when I watch him. And, so it's not surprising to me that the NFL sort of looked at it and said, well, Josh Rosen had a cannon too, and we took him 10th, and look how that turned out. And there have been a lot of guys who've had big time arms who've gotten drafted who haven't panned out. That's a lot more to the position. Hey, I hope he does well, right? I hope he does. I don't want to see anybody fail. I'm not rooting against. The only person I'm rooting against is Will Rogers, because you're so high on Will Rogers at any given time. But look, I'm not going to be displeased if he proves me right, I suppose. But I don't wish ill on anybody. I just don't think he's going to be. I don't think Will Levis is going to pan out in Tennessee. Put it that way.
I've never talked about Will Rogers for the NFL. You can get that slander out of here, Will. Get that slander out of here. I've never mentioned him. I just said college system, man. I thought he was going to do a little better last year than he did. All right, but keep bringing that up by all means. Will Levis to the Titans there. I ran Carthon, GM for the Tennessee Titans there. Florida, the old Florida running back under Zook there. So first draft there for the Titans. So again, another Gator trying to build up a Jags rival here. So let's go on to the fourth round, or let's go on the day 3 here in 4 bits. Talk about Ventrell Miller. Speaking of the Jacksonville Jaguars, round 4, the 121st pick goes to Ventrell Miller, the linebacker. We've seen him overcome injury. This is a guy that seemed to be a great locker room guy throughout his time at Florida, but also really stout against the run. Maybe you'd want a little more out of him in coverage, but overall just a steady, solid player for a defense that otherwise struggled throughout times. And Miller had his struggles at times too, but there were some games where he would just light it up and be on fire. And there's other games, I would not encourage people to go watch that Alabama tape from the 2020 SEC championship, for example, but that's why you fall to round 4 as a pretty solid player, because you have those ups and downs a little bit. I think the Jags are getting a guy that's at least going to be a strong contributor on special teams, and I feel like Miller's going to be the type of guy, as long as he can stay healthy, type of guy who can put together a nice pro career.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've been talking about Florida's linebackers for years and how they're not very good, especially in coverage. And 2 years ago, with just the massive counters that were, time after time after time. Now, Ventrell Miller wasn't there when they were running the counters because he was injured at the time. But still, linebacker has just been an area that Florida has not had a ton of talent and has not had a lot of productivity. I think in many ways, though, Dexter going in the second round, Miller here in the fourth, and then a guy we're going to talk about in a second going in the NFL draft says something about what people think about the defensive scheme, about Todd Grantham and about Patrick Toney. Hopefully Austin Armstrong's able to turn that around. But, what this says to me is that people think Miller has leadership skills. They see his motor when he's out there on the field, and they go, he has not been coached in a way that has allowed him to excel, and that he didn't have the defensive line in front of him to help him excel and keep the tackles off of, or the pulling guards off of him. So, we'll see. We'll see. I don't know that he's fast enough to be a 3-down linebacker in the NFL, but I don't know that the fourth round you're necessarily looking for a 3-down linebacker.
There's a role. There's a role for Miller that fits, that he can make work in the NFL.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess I look at this and go, with as bad as Florida's defense was last year, should 2 of their guys in the front 7 gone in the top 121 picks of the draft? You got a hard time convincing me that's true. That if you've got these guys in there, the defense should have been better, and it just wasn't. And so, we'll see. I have a lot of respect for Ventrell Miller. He was one of the guys who got caught up in that credit card scandal early on, stayed with the program, stayed here, took his extra COVID year, so he is a year older. And then you've got and certainly was productive. And that's the thing, is if you look at it, not only are you looking at his skills and his skill set and his projection, this is one where you're not projecting. You're saying he's probably pretty close to a finished product. This is who he is. And if who he is good enough, we're going to put him out on the field, and we think he'll turn out well. So we'll see. I think, it's all going to be a question of can he cover guys in space in the NFL, because that was always an issue at Florida. But was that scheme or was that Ventrell Miller? We're going to find out.
Yeah, by the way, the credit card scandal you're referring to was back in the Jim McElwain days. So if you want to know how long Ventrell Miller's been around Gainesville, that feels like a good decade ago. So that's multiple coaching regimes there for Miller. So best of luck going to the 4th round of the Jacksonville Jaguars here. Next off the board, Justin Shorter, 5th round, 150th pick to the Buffalo Bills. The Bills picked up. This isn't their last Gator. They must have liked what they saw here out of Florida. Shorter, again, not necessarily blazing speed, but we've always said the body type, no doubt of the body type for an NFL receiver. Certainly a guy that could have a role in the red zone. You could definitely see him being the type of guy that goes up there and gets a few touchdown passes every season there from Josh Allen. Will.
Yeah, I mean, look, he was effective last year. He was much more explosive last year than he was the year before. He just really couldn't stay healthy this past year, and so that impacted how productive he could be. But you think about the opening play against LSU, everybody's going to remember that. He's the only guy who you could throw to on the outside. There was that 4th and 1 against Tennessee where they threw down the sideline, and he jumped over the corner and was able to get it. So, he has some athletic ability. He has the ability to go up and get the ball. He is a bigger receiver, which is something that you start looking for, right? There are going to be deficiencies in every receiver once you get to the 5th round. And so the question is, what are you looking for if you were a team that's trying to develop a wide receiver? And you think about the guys that Buffalo has, you got Diggs there at wide receiver. He is not a huge guy who's going up and getting the ball in the red zone. Gabe, I can't remember Gabe's last name. Gabe Davis. Yeah. He's also not a big guy. He's a burner, right? He's a guy who's going to go get the ball. They had Cole Beasley last year, who's playing in the slot. Justin Shorter is a very different kind of wide receiver, right? And so they've just brought in somebody who can potentially get on the outside, catch back shoulder fades. You think about the ability of Josh Allen to fit it into small spaces, and all of a sudden you go, all right, well, he doesn't necessarily need to separate. What he needs is Josh Allen to throw it right on his back shoulder, and then for him to have the body, the agility to contort his body to be able to get that ball and be able to get up over a corner. And Shorter's certainly big enough to be able to do that. And if somebody starts playing that back shoulder, does he have enough speed to then straight line take it deep, and can Josh hit him? And I think the answer is yes on both of those. And so, look, I don't expect him to be a starter next year, but I think a solid
No.
depth piece and
Come in and
just
catch
some.
25 passes or something like that. Maybe three or four touchdowns type of
Yeah, I
season.
think you're probably looking at like 15, but
Yeah.
again, it's somebody who's going to be able to contribute. And you start thinking about what you're looking for with these guys who come in sort of on the end of the bench. You need guys who are going to play special teams, and a tall guy who can come off the edge is somebody who has value. And so you're going to have imperfections in the 5th round, and Shorter has some, but he has a lot of ability as well. And so that's what Buffalo's seeing.
Last Gator off the board for the draft, 6th round pick, 203rd pick of the draft to the Las Vegas Raiders. We saw Amari Burney go. Burney's is a guy that they moved him to linebacker during his career. He was bit all over the place. Not your prototypical linebacker. He's going to be. I think he's going to be a great special teams player in the league here. But I do think that even though he had his ups and downs during his time at Florida, this was a guy that showed up week to week, and you could count on to be a productive player. I know you could point out some things with Burney, but I mean, came up with that big play against Utah. That'll be forever remembered. That interception in the end zone against Utah, and had some good moments in the orange and blue. So Amari Burney coming off the board here in the 6th round.
Yeah, Bernie's an older guy, but this is actually, I think, a projection pick as well, right? These are guys. This is a pick where you say this guy hasn't played linebacker for very long, and look at the leap he made from 2021 to 2022. That he really improved last year. Was he perfect? No, he was not perfect at linebacker last year, but he was a whole lot better last year than he was 2 years ago. And out of all the defense wasn't good last year, but there were a couple of bright spots, and Bernie was one of them. So if I'm the Raiders, I'm looking at it and I'm going in the 6th round again. There are guys who have imperfections, but Bernie has some athletic skills that you're not necessarily going to get in the 6th round at the linebacker position. And in many ways, his struggles at linebacker, especially a couple of years ago, had more to do with knowing the position and being instinctual. So the question becomes, do you become instinctual as you get more time there? So even though he's an older player, hasn't played a ton of snaps at that position, you get him in with the right position coaches studying all the time. Can that start to become more instinctual, and can he start to excel in that role? I don't know. I mean, that's something where it's like, I think in many ways, linebackers kind of like quarterback, right? You'll sit there and look at it and go, you either have it or you don't. I think having those instincts or not having those instincts kind of comes with the territory there. But again, he improved so much from last year to this year. You do wonder, what's he going to be able to do going to the league? And like you said, he's going to be able to contribute in special teams. That's certainly something you're looking for late in the draft.
The rest of the Gators here who are joining NFL rosters were undrafted. Let's start with those safeties, Will. We got Trey Dean going to the Jets and Rashad Torrance going to the Rams. Both these guys ran disappointing 40 times in the pre-draft process. Dean had the MVP, won the MVP on defense at the East-West Shrine game. So for him to go undrafted, that's a little bit interesting. I maybe I should say it's more interesting that he won the MVP at the East-West Shrine Bowl there, Will. But Dean, certainly a guy that seems to have a lot of the physical skills. To me, when I watch him play, not necessarily a guy that's in the right place at the right time at all times. He put up a lot of numbers on the tackling front, and yet there's still something to be left to desired there in the tackling there. Torrance, though, I would have thought Torrance would have gotten drafted. I'm a little surprised, even with the disappointing speed there, Will. Hey, look, we saw Torrance struggle at times too, but Torrance just seems like a guy that you can develop a little bit, and there should be some type of role for him. I am surprised that Torrance went undrafted.
I mean, I'm not surprised they went undrafted. I'm surprised. I'm also not surprised they're getting brought in as undrafted free agents. I think you look at guys who have that many snaps in a major school and you go, all right, yeah, these are guys who are worth taking a flyer on. At the same time, I mean, we saw the tape. Like the secondary last year was like Swiss cheese. And, Dean and Torrance were a big part of that, Trevez Johnson as well. And so, I think I don't think Billy Napier and company were like incredibly sad that they've got a lot of turnover at the defensive back position this year heading into 2023. Now, certainly I think, they can use all the help they can through the transfer portal, through recruiting, all that sort of stuff. But, look, there were multiple times last year where you'd hear reporters and people who know the game who would say, Florida doesn't have enough all SEC talent or enough SEC talent on the defensive side of the ball. And I think that's what you saw when you saw those 40 times, right? I mean, these are guys who are effective safeties at a certain level, but did not have the athletic ability to keep up. So you make a mistake, you're out of position, and all of a sudden the guy's wide open because you don't have the makeup speed. You see that a lot with some of these elite SEC teams where a guy gets open because of a mistake, but then the throw goes. And if the throw's a little bit short, you have the chance to catch up. And these guys just couldn't catch up. So I hope they do well. I hope they're going to catch on. Dean obviously shows out at the Shrine Bowl and ends up MVP of that, and that's great. But that's still against college guys. When you're out there against, when you're out there against guys like the Cheetah and Jalen Waddle and those guys who just have unbelievable type of speed, we'll see, right? I think 4-3 and 4-7.
The Jets don't play the Dolphins that much, do they?
Not at all. Not at all.
Well,
the good news is he'll have Aaron Rodgers thrown at him in practice. So
yeah, good practice there.
If not,
let's go on here. Richard Garage to the Bills. Another surprise here. Well, I really would have expected Garage to be drafted. I saw a lot of projections for him in sixth, seventh round, but I would have expected him to be drafted here. Buffalo picks up another solid offensive lineman here from Florida and the third Gator overall.
Yeah, I'm surprised at this one because Garage is a guy who, when you look at the recruiting profiles of that 2019 class or 2018 class, you go, he's one of the ones who turned into what I would almost a star, right? Like he's not a guy you looked at and said, oh, like this is a can't miss first round draft pick in the NFL. But look, I mean, Anthony Richardson and even before him, Kyle Trask weren't necessarily getting drilled all the time when you had guys like Garage out there at left tackle and, playing that many games in the SEC, staying healthy in the SEC. Like, Garage was able to play through pain because you don't go through a 13-game SEC season without being nicked. And so the fact that he was always out there and that he was a part of an offensive line that was able to really be physical and lead the league in rushing for the most part. I think they were right up there with Alabama the last couple of years, with Garage being a big part of that. And so that's a little bit surprising, but again, I think he lands in a good spot, right? You land in a place where you've got Josh Allen, same thing as Osiris Torrance. They're going to have two guys there at the same time. So you got sort of some familiarity with one of your buddies who's there as well. And then certainly I think that Buffalo has seen something in the Napier offense that they like in terms of the offensive linemen, what they're doing, how they're trained to block, all that sort of stuff. And so you bring in a guy like Garage who, quite honestly, I think a lot of us thought was going to go in the 5th or 6th round and bring him in as an undrafted free agent. He's a guy who I could see starting by the end of the year. Right. He's a guy who I think comes in camp. You go, oh, this guy's better than we thought. He's got some limitations, but man, he's better than we thought. Now, the question there is, are you going to slide him over to right tackle because you don't want him going up against that defensive end there at left tackle? And in that case, he'd have to learn a new position, right? The footwork's backwards. And so, that might be part of why he's an undrafted free agent is people said, we're going to have to move him out to right tackle. That's going to be a completely different position. How can we get, how will he be able to do that? And how do we project that? So he's also, again, one of those older guys, right? And so he's probably a finished product. You're not projecting him as, oh, he's got all this athletic ability and we just need to teach him. He's had plenty of teaching. Now it's a question of, is his athletic ability, does that translate to the NFL? Mm-hmm. And clearly, I think there were some questions there, and that's one of the reasons why he ends up not getting drafted.
Well, if he does make it, you got potentially him and Osiris as two starters for one of the best offenses in football for the foreseeable future, at least the next few years, you would think, up in Buffalo. Will, one major note here. We are recording this on Sunday night here, and as of now, Brenton Cox has not signed anywhere. Yeah, he didn't get drafted. Again, definitely the type of guy you would think someone would take a flyer on, at least in the 7th round. You're sitting there. I know there's questions about his exit from Florida. There might be questions about his exit from Georgia too, but this is a guy that he definitely has an elite set of skills if you can just channel it the right way and get him to do the right thing. But I know there are a lot of NFL teams that remove guys off their board for less than what Brenton Cox has been through. So I'm assuming that he just wasn't a guy that made a lot of boards if he went completely undrafted there. And I hope he gets a good opportunity here. I keep saying I would like to see him play with Belichick. I'd like to see him in New England, but has not signed as of Sunday night.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we've all seen the tape. He struggled. And, there were times where he would pop and there were times where he looked pedestrian. And, for all the skill set that you have, if you look pedestrian and you're struggling to take coaching, which, leaving two different programs tends to indicate that. I think this says something, look, the coaches talk. And so Kirby Smart, I'm sure, was asked, and I'm sure Billy Napier was asked, and probably Dan Mullen was asked too about Brenton Cox. Grantham was probably asked, and Patrick Toney was probably asked, right? And so all of these guys have an opinion, and the question is, did that opinion color whether he was on people's draft boards and how many draft boards he was on? And it certainly appears so. So I think from a pure talent standpoint, you'd say, yeah, I think, he probably should, you take a flyer on him late. From a productivity standpoint, though, I don't think you do. And so that's the question, right? You've got this talent profile that isn't matching the productivity. And, you could say the same thing about Anthony Richardson, right? That you've got a talent profile that's not meeting the productivity, but you also don't have any of those red flags with Anthony Richardson. And so, that combination, I think he'll get picked up somewhere, right? Everybody's always looking for talent at defensive end. And so if there's an opportunity to bring in a pass rusher who's going to give you 4, 5, 6 sacks, I think you do it. But, as of right now, hasn't happened.
Which, for the record, I think he's probably not signed anywhere because he probably does have options, and he's probably weighing his decision at some point. That would be my guess on that. I don't know that for sure, but a guy like that, again, how does one team not look at that guy and go, 7th round pick, let's give it a shot? I kind of mind boggling on that, but Brent Cox not picked up at this point. Let's move on to 6 bits here, Will, and we'll turn our attention up north to your hometown, as a matter of fact, which I believe they are renaming Georgiadelphia because Howie Roseman is just stacking the Philadelphia Eagles with Georgia Bulldogs players over the last couple of years. And while it's painful on the surface, it's even more painful considering that Roseman is a 1997 Florida graduate. While on the phone with the Eagles' second first-round draft pick of the night was Georgia edge Nolan Smith. Roseman didn't hold back. He said, quote, "I'm a Florida Gator. Do you know how much this hurts my soul to take all these effing Georgia Bulldogs?" And Smith started laughing on the phone. He said, "You want to win. That's why. You want to win." He's like, "Yeah, I want to win." So earlier in the evening, Billy had snagged Jalen Carter, who had fell. And Carter, of course, at one point was projected either to go between 1 and 3. I mean, Carter's a heck of a talent, but he's had issues off the field here. So Philadelphia, with that pick that they did trade up a spot from 10 to 9, but the pick they had acquired from New Orleans, they were in position to get Jalen Carter. Man, and that's coming after last year, right? Last year they took a couple Bulldogs last year in the 22 draft. Jordan Davis, N'Kobe Dean early on, and so this time they took 3 Bulldogs in the first 105 picks of the 2023 draft here, and they traded for former Georgia running back DeAndre Swift from Detroit. So, man, he's stacking up. He likes what Kirby Smart's doing down there in Athens. And Roseman was on an interview with ESPN. He said, "I'm sure I'm out of the Florida Alumni Association as we speak." So Roseman at least acknowledges it. But hey, you could spin it and say there's a lot of Florida Georgia Bulldogs who are working for a Gator. You could say it that way. Well, I don't know. That's about the only silver lining I see on that.
I mean, look, I think there were a lot of Florida guys taken in the draft, but there were a lot of elite Georgia players taken in the draft. It's not news to us that Georgia has had good players the last 2 years. I mean, they're 2-time national champions at this point. And, it sucks to admit that. It sucks that it's happened, but it's happened. And so to sit there and put your head in the sand and ostrich it and ignore it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You just say, we got to catch them. And there are ways to catch them. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but you got to catch them. And I think Philadelphia took advantage of the fact that Jalen Carter fell because of the incident that happened after the championship parade. But now you got Carter next to Davis there on the inside of that line. And look, I mean, Philadelphia, I think, is pretty set on the offensive side, goes to the Super Bowl last year, and now has reinforced its defense with the guys they took in this particular draft. I can't blame anybody for taking Georgia players. Look, I mean, it was amazing when you looked at that first round. It was like Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia. It was like, every once in a while they'd slip in a Clemson or slip in, an LSU or something like that. But for the most part, it was just like that whole first round was the SEC championship game and from 2 years ago. And then anybody who was left over this year after getting them all drafted last year. Now, the one question I do have is with all the Georgia Bulldogs who got drafted, Does that mean they got anybody left? Like, can we have a year where they like take a step back because, they've had all these guys
Unfortunately.
drafted, and we'll see. That's maybe the silver lining is,
Well,
hell, I don't care what happens with the Eagles. Like, I mean, I live up here, but I sort of schadenfreude them. It's like when they lose, I get to like look at my friends and go, ah. But so hopefully a bunch of Bulldogs lose in the NFL, and then the Bulldogs lose in college because all these guys went to the NFL.
little did we know, we've been talking about their little walk-on quarterback for the last couple of years here. Little did we know they were rolling with a 4th-round draft pick in the NFL. That I was stunned that he went in the 4th, but interesting pick by the Rams. But I good for him. Good for him. Definitely had 2 great seasons. And Stetson Bennett, he definitely this season, he had some great. He went toe to toe with C.J. Stroud. I thought that Georgia Ohio State game, I thought C.J. Stroud played outstanding in that game, but Bennett went toe to toe with him, and he kept that offense cooking for Georgia all year long. So that was an interesting pick, considering they just got rid of Baker Mayfield out there in LA. You would think if they like that style of quarterback, you could have just kept Baker, but I guess it's a little cheaper just go out and draft another guy. But Bennett seems like he'll get that opportunity out with the Rams there. Well,
Look, not a lot of 4th-round quarterbacks end up being major players in the NFL. I mean, I think Kirk Cousins was taken in the 3rd. You start thinking about where these guys were taken. Not a lot of them were taken late. I think you could say Heineke was somebody who was an undrafted free
Minshew
agent.
was the 5th.
Minshew was in the
Yeah,
So I mean, again,
like
now he may be really brilliant because he's going to start the Chase Daniel career here, where he just goes around and ends up being the backup quarterback for everybody for the next decade or something. Look, I mean, Stetson Bennett earned it. He played well the last 2 years. I think 2 years ago we said we thought he was going to gack up the game against Alabama, and it turns out he did in the SEC championship game, and then in the national championship game he made the plays he needed to. And last year, again, against Ohio State, made just enough plays to win that game, and then came out and absolutely blitzkrieg TCU. We'll see how he does when he doesn't have way more talent than everybody else every week that he goes out there, because that game against Missouri sticks in my head last year. Now, look, he made 2 big drives at the end to get Georgia over the hump against Tigers there, but for the first 3 quarters, it was pretty ugly. So, he's a 4th-round pick. He's going to get an opportunity to be on a roster. That's great. I don't think he's going to be starting anytime soon, but if Stafford goes down and he has an opportunity to step in, we'll see how he does. I think he's going to struggle in the NFL. I think that there are skills you need in the NFL that you don't necessarily need in college, and how that translates, we'll see. But he's getting an opportunity, and we'll get to examine that in more depth as time goes on.
Well, plenty of other dogs drafted, but I just really want to talk about the Philadelphia angle there. So we'll move on from this. We'll move on from this. Hey, at one point, let's move on to Dollar and talk about some recruiting ties with the draft. At one point, you had texted that you were looking at the 2020 class, and they had a ton of the top 30 went in the first 2 rounds. So throughout the weekend, I saw plenty of other interesting recruiting ties, but let's start with that point, Will.
Yeah, so I looked at the top 25, 1 through 25. 17 of those guys got drafted. So 68%. These are guys who aren't eligible, they don't have to be eligible, right? This is 3 years out from their recruiting class. And so these are guys who declared early. 17 of the 25 were drafted. 8 of the 25 went in the first round. So you're talking 68% of that top 25 got drafted, 32% got drafted in the first round. So when we talk about top 25 commits being can't miss prospects, this is what we mean. We mean you got a 7 in 10 shot that 3 years from now these guys are getting drafted, and you have a 1 in 3 shot that these guys are going in the first round of the NFL draft. That's a big time add to your program when you bring in that guy. And the reason I separate it from 1 to 25 is if you look at 26 to 50, you only have 6 of the 25 guys in that 26 to 50 who got drafted, and 2 of the 25 in the first round. Now, it is interesting that if you actually look at the average draft position for the top 25 is 81.6. The average draft position for the secondary 25 is 62. So it's lower. So what that tells you is that some of these guys, like CJ Stroud, end up leaving school early because they know they're going to be a high draft pick. A guy like Jacqueline Roy from LSU ends up in the 5th round. But then you've got Tank Bigsby out of Auburn, goes in the 3rd round. You've got Michael Meyer out of Notre Dame going in the 2nd round. You got Jackson Smith-Jigba going in the 1st round. So these are all high quality guys who are going really, really high. But let's be honest, the top 25 is just dominated. Like, it absolutely dominated the draft. You got 8 first round picks out of the top 25 of the 2020 class. And that's why we care. That's why we talk about elite prospects. You can sign guys who are in the 100 to 200 range all you want. You're going to end up with the results like you do 26 through 50. And you're not going to end up with guys who like the guys I think about are like Bryce Young and Will Anderson from Alabama. Those guys would have been first round picks last year if they'd have been able to leave. Right. And so that's the kind of impact you're really looking for when you start looking at these guys. Is these are guys who are contributing very early on to your program. So if you want to turn around a program, that's how you do it. You do it with the top 25 guys. And thankfully, Florida's starting to get those guys, right? DJ Lagway in this 2024 class fits that profile. And they got a couple of guys who are really close who may end up working their way up into that range. And certainly you've got a large opportunity for the guys in 26 through 50 to come through too. It's not like there's no first round picks there, but your chances of hitting a first round pick go down by half, right? I mean, you go from 68% in the first round to 24% in the first round, just going from 1 through 25 to 26 through 50. So when we talk about 5 stars, and Alabama brings in 7 5-stars, and Georgia brings in 5, and then Florida brings in 0 or 1, and even if their average player rating is up at 92, it's still just like you've got guys who are NFL quality guys before their eligibility has run out versus what we saw this year, right? Where we've got Anthony Richardson coming in. He's one of those guys who did go early and was in this 2020 class, right? And so he's one of those outliers. But if you're relying on outliers, you're going to struggle. And that's sort of what we've seen is when you play a team like Georgia, you're getting all of these guys from Georgia and Ohio State and Alabama who come out there and are ready for the NFL while you're still developing to be ready for the NFL. And that's why these teams keep winning.
Let's build on that point there from Bud Elliott, 24/7 Sports. He said the last 4 schools to win a national title have averaged 10 top 50 selections in the following 2 NFL drafts. Whew. I mean, if that doesn't make it as clear as day, I don't know what does. Well,
I mean, I think at this point, anybody who's denying that recruiting is critical is delusional. The question then becomes how critical, right? And where does that drop off come? And the stat that I've cited is the one I put in an article maybe a month or 2 ago, where I was looking at the teams that win the national championship and make the actual championship game. And it was like the top 5 recruiting classes ever since the playoff, or the top 5 recruiting programs by average player rating ever since the playoff came into existence have won every national title and have won every semifinal game except for 2 in terms of like getting to the finals, right? There's only been 2 teams that have been outside of that top 5. And those 2 teams that made it happened to make it because in the final 4, they got 2 teams that weren't in the top 5, right? So Michigan wasn't in the top 5 of the recruiting rankings, and TCU was not in the top 5 of the recruiting rankings. TCU makes the final, but they never had to play a team that was in the top 5. And then when they did, we kind of saw what happened. So that's why the Michigan States of the world and the Michigans of the world even have struggled when they've made it to the playoff, because these teams are just different. And we see that over and over and over again. We see it with recruiting rankings. We see it with wins. We see it with playoff appearances. We see it with championships. And now we're seeing it with the NFL draft. It's just the same story over and over and over again. It's not. Now, look, I think you can do different things to try to bring in these elite recruits. I think the transfer portal maybe opens up some different avenues to build. But let's not kid ourselves. You need to build with these types of guys. And this is one of the reasons why snagging 5-star guys in the transfer portal doesn't appeal to me as much as snagging a 5-star guy out of high school, because the 5-star guy in the transfer portal should be one of these guys who's making it through. And in fact, if you go through the list, DeMarcus Bowman is on this list of guys who were not drafted, who was a 5-star commit to Clemson. That's a guy who was a miss. Eli Ricks is a guy who was at LSU, who I think is transferred out of there, ended up transferring to Alabama. He still hasn't made his way into the NFL draft yet. So when you see a guy who's transferring out, it's not just because he's behind somebody else. It's because he's not that can't miss guy who after his sophomore year, you're sitting there going, oh, that guy would be a 1st-round draft pick if he left right now. I think the last guy Florida had in that mold was probably CJ Henderson. Like, he's a guy who after his sophomore year, we went, oh, that guy would be drafted if he could come out right now. And Florida needs 4 or 5 of those guys on the team to compete with the rest of the SEC. And, obviously the 2024 class is the first step towards getting that done. but the 2023 and 2022 classes have not done what they needed to do to get Florida back into that upper echelon.
We may finally get to see some DeMarcus Bowman this year in Orlando at UCF. So we'll see if that happens there. A couple other tidbits from Bud Elliott. Anthony Richardson is the first quarterback drafted in the top 4 off a college team with a losing record since Purdue's Jim Everett in 1985. Feel like Bud, the Florida State and Bud just comes out sometimes, doesn't it? Will, that's an
I think
interesting
that's Chris. That's Chris Everett, right?
Say it again. Say Chris again.
We're too old. Nobody's going to understand that reference. Go check it out on YouTube.
Jim Rome. Jim Rome, yeah, he would always call it Jim Rome. Always called Jim Everett, Chris Everett, the tennis player, and Jim. I guess, Jim Everett didn't take it kindly. Challenged him to say it again in front of his face, and then it's just staggering how much taller Jim Everett is than Jim Rome, too. That was one of the funniest parts about that tape. I think you listen to Rome's show and people bring that situation up about once a week, at least, still to this day.
I didn't even know Rome was still on the radio. So that's, podcast, I guess, these days. But,
I listened to Rome through college and stuff. They would bring that up a lot. But yeah, that's a great situation. Jim Everett and Jim Rome. Look that up if you haven't seen it. Another fact here from Bud Elliott: 2 Power 5 teams won 10 games in 2022 and did not have a player selected in the top 4 rounds, both Washington and FSU.
Well, we just talked about the recruiting aspect of things, and Florida State. I said this at the end of last year, and I still mean it now. I would rather be in Florida's situation with Billy Napier than in Florida State's situation with Mike Norvell. Norvell may win more games this year, but Norvell is not going to win more games in the long run, considering Florida is running heads and tails around him on the recruiting trail. At some point, that's going to catch up with Norvell, and they're going to start losing. And I think we've seen them lose a lot. We saw them turn it around with having Jordan Travis last year at quarterback. If Travis ends up having a substandard year, or if he ends up getting injured, I hope he doesn't, but if he ends up getting injured, then you're going to see him go right back to the 6-6 team that we saw 2 years ago against Florida, where that might have been the most boring Florida State game I've ever seen, where Richardson came in with a bum knee, leading Florida to like 7 points that ends up being the difference in the game. Emory Jones was awful in that one. Travis was awful in that one. And what was like 17-14? They had the missed onside kick. The guy just completely whiffed on the onside kick.
Yeah.
Like, we're not that far from that game for Mike Norvell. So the idea that Florida State is like way above and beyond where anybody should think. All right. And the other thing is that he's far enough along at this point that the guys he brought in three years ago should be starting to make their way to the NFL. And the fact that they haven't yet said something about the long-term stability of that program. There were a lot of people when Florida was going 10-3 and 11-2 who were throwing dirt at me and saying that the recruiting talk was too much and that Mullen could find his way around that and all that sort of stuff. And in some ways, look, he was able to win 21 games in those first 2 years. And so he was able to get around some of those deficiencies. 2020, it started to catch up. 2021, it definitely caught up. That same thing's going to happen in Norvell at Florida State. And we're seeing it in the NFL draft is, if the NFL doesn't want your players, eventually you're going to cap out at 9 or 10 wins. And maybe that's good enough for Florida State, and maybe they can maintain that. But, the idea that they're going to be in the playoff year after year after year because they're slowly building to something, I think is misplaced unless they end up with an elite quarterback who can lead them there.
We had several very painful FSU games to watch this past decade. The 27-2 game stands out to me. I was at the game too where the 2013 team smacked us. Kelvin Benjamin just went off. That was a pretty rough game too. Not a great decade for the Florida State game.
Yeah, I was at that Treon game with the safety being the only points, and all
awful.
I remember from that is the first game I ever took my daughter to, and I told her in the first half that she could have cotton candy in the second half, and by the time the second half came around, I'm like, well, I don't want to watch this crap anyway. I'll go find it. And the swamp was out; they didn't have any cotton candy, so I had an angry child on my hands. So that's my memory from that one. I had a great time with her. She enjoyed it, and we had a good time. My oldest boy I took, and he just didn't take to it. But the youngest boy I took last year when he was 7, he took to it. So we're 2 for 3 now at this point.
Yeah, that was a no cotton candy for you type of day. Per On3 Twitter, SEC led the way with 62 players drafted, Big Ten 55, ACC 32, Big 12 30, and the Pac 12 had 27 players drafted in this year's draft. Well, I don't think this is new information, but you just see it's not just what's on the field on Saturdays that you look at the SEC and the Big Ten as two conferences that are pulling away, but further evidence that this is where the talent resides in college football.
Just means more, man. It really does.
All right. SEC slogan from Will Miles there. All right. Sounds good. Hey, Will, where can people get the magazine and when can they do their pre-order for?
Yep. So readandreaction.com/MAG. That's readandreaction.com/mag. Pre-orders until May 8th. We'll still be taking orders after that, but then we're not going to guarantee that you'll get it by Memorial Day. We'll be doing another push there before Father's Day as well, I'm sure. So, but hey, pre-order it now, get it for your dad, get it for your brother, get it for the whatever Mother's Day is coming up. Get it for your wife or your mother if you think she'd like it. It's going to be 70 pages, Florida Gators only. A lot of these preseason magazines, we love them. They're fun, but it's a page or two for your favorite team. This is going to be 70 pages for your favorite team. So again, go over there to readandreaction.com/mag. It's readandreaction.com/MAG. Check it out. Help us out. We appreciate it. The more you guys pre-order it, the more confidence we have to continue doing this. The second year we've done it, and certainly we're hoping to be able to do it year after year after year, but want to make sure that it makes sense given the amount of time we got to put into it.
Yeah, 70 pages of a Florida Gators 2023 season preview. We'll do a lot of deep dives, the type of stuff you see from Will and I all the time in that magazine. The link is below in the description. Thanks a lot for joining another episode of Stand Up and Holler. For Will Miles, I'm Nick Knudsen. Have a great week, everybody, and go Gators.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to Stand Up and Holler. If you're interested in more information from me and Nick, you can go over to readandreaction.com. You can like and subscribe our YouTube channel here at Read and Reaction, or you can go to patreon.com/readandreaction to support us, get extra information, and we do Ask Anythings over there every once in a while as well. So check us out. Thanks for listening.